Montana Territory, 1875. Willowcreek sat nestled against the Bitterroot Mountains like a secret whispered among giants. As summer surrendered to autumn, the cottonwoods along the creek shimmered gold, catching the late September light. It was in this light that Ethan Jameson saw her for the first time, the woman who would make him question everything he believed about life on the frontier. At 25, Ethan had already decided that the West was no place for love. He'd watched too many men bury their hearts alongside their wives and children, victims of disease, harsh winters, or Indian raids. A cowboy's life was meant for solitude, moving with the seasons, following the herds, sleeping under stars that offered cold company. Love was a luxury for townsfolk with sturdy walls and doctors nearby, not for men who lived by the strength of their backs and the speed of their draw. Just passing through, he always told folks who asked if he planned to stay. 5 years of drifting since the war had hardened something in him, sealed off the chambers of his heart like a mine abandoned after the gold played out. His external goal remained simple. Earn enough to buy his own spread someday, far from others, where he could live by his own rules. What he refused to acknowledge was the creeping loneliness that sometimes woke him in the night, the need for something more than just survival. On this particular afternoon, Ethan rode into Willowcreek for supplies before heading north with a cattle drive. The town was hardly more than a wide spot in the road, a general store, saloon, livery stable, and a dozen or so buildings strung along a rutted main street. He tied his sorrel gelding outside the general store and adjusted his worn Stetson before entering. The bell above the door announced his arrival, though few looked up. A couple of old-timers playing checkers by the stove, a mother examining fabric with a squirming child at her skirts, and behind the counter her. Grace Blackburn stood sorting mail, her dark brown hair, the color of pine bark after rain, pinned neatly at the nape of her neck, though rebellious wisps had escaped to frame her face. At 22, she carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who had weathered disappointments with grace. Her blue calico dress was simple but well kept, its high collar and modest cut a contrast to the painted women in the saloon across the street. What struck Ethan wasn't just her obvious beauty, the kind that didn't need rouge or fancy trimmings, but the solitude that seemed to surround her like an invisible fence. She looked up as he approached the counter, and her eyes, deep blue like mountain lupin, met his without the flirtation or shyness he often encountered from unmarried women. "Help you find something?" she asked, setting the mail aside. "Coffee, flour, sugar," he replied. "Heading north with a herd, need to stock up." She nodded and began gathering his supplies, moving with efficiency. "Just you alone?" "Just me," he confirmed. "Always is." Something in her expression shifted, not pity but recognition. "That simplifies things, I imagine." "It does." He watched her measure coffee beans into a paper sack, struck by the grace of her movements. "You run this place yourself?" "With my uncle. He's the postmaster too, but he's laid up with his back. Doctor says he shouldn't be lifting." There was a matter-of-factness to her tone that suggested this wasn't a temporary arrangement. As she totaled his purchases, a commotion outside drew their attention. Through the window, they could see a wagon had overturned, spilling a load of lumber across the street. A man was shouting, waving his arms at the driver. "Third accident this month," Grace said. "They're rushing to finish the new boarding house before winter." "Town's growing then." Trying to. Railroad survey came through in spring. Everyone's hoping for a spur line. She handed him his change, their fingers brushing momentarily. "That's why folks like you just passing through might start staying." There was no invitation in her words, just a statement of fact, but something in them snagged in Ethan's mind like a burr on wool. He tipped his hat and gathered his supplies, but as he stepped back into the autumn sunlight, he found himself wondering about the woman with the lupin eyes and what kept her in a town that was more promise than reality. What happened next wasn't in Ethan's plans. As he secured his supplies to his saddle, a commotion erupted from the saloon. A man stumbled out, followed by angry shouts. Ethan recognized the signs of trouble instantly, the man's hand hovering near his pistol, the tense set of his shoulders. Before he could react, shots rang out. People scattered from the street as the man fired wildly, glass shattering as a bullet hit the general store window. Without thinking, Ethan rushed back inside, finding Grace crouched behind the counter. "Stay down," he ordered, drawing his Colt revolver. From outside came more shouts, then silence, then heavy footsteps on the porch. The door crashed open and the drunken shooter staggered in, his eyes wild. "Where's that cheatin' Blackburn?" he slurred. "Told me there'd be work with the railroad, spent my last dollar gettin' here." Grace rose slowly, her face pale but composed. My uncle never guaranteed work, Mr. Dawson. He only said they'd be hiring if the survey went well. The man's gun wavered between her and Ethan. Well, it didn't, and now I'm broke in this godforsaken hole. Ethan stepped forward, his own weapon steady. That's enough. Put it down before you do something you can't take back. What followed was a tense standoff, broken only when the town marshal finally arrived. The drunk was disarmed and hauled away, but not before spitting at Grace's feet and promising retribution against all Blackburns. After the marshal left, Ethan found himself alone with Grace in the shattered store. She swept glass with mechanical precision, her hands steady even as her shoulders betrayed her tension. Does that happen often? He asked, kneeling to help gather larger shards. Disappointed men, yes, armed ones less so. She paused, studying him. You didn't have to come back in. Most wouldn't have. I'm not most, the words came without thought, surprising him. For the first time she smiled, a small thing but genuine. No, Mr. Jameson, I don't believe you are. That might have been the end of it, a chance encounter, a moment of danger, a parting with nothing more exchanged than names. But as Ethan helped her board up the broken window, learning that her uncle's debts were mounting alongside his health problems, he found himself making an offer that contradicted every rule he'd set for himself. I've got experience with cattle. If your uncle needs help, I could delay heading north. Autumn Drive won't leave for another week. She studied him, suspicious of unexpected kindness. We can't pay much. Room and board would do. He couldn't explain, even to himself, why staying suddenly seemed more appealing than moving on. And so Ethan found himself with temporary roots in Willowcreek, repairing the store by day and sleeping in a small room above it at night. Each morning he'd hear Grace moving about below, opening the store, her footsteps a gentle rhythm that marked the beginning of his day. Each evening they'd share simple meals with her uncle, Marshal Blackburn, a once robust man now bent by pain and worry. Through these quiet days, Ethan learned Grace's story in pieces, how she'd come west as a girl with her parents, only to lose them to typhoid within a year. How her uncle had taken her in, the only family she had left. How at 22 she'd watched as every girl her age in Willowcreek had married, been chosen, started families, while she remained tending to her uncle and the store, passed over for prettier, wealthier, or less burdened women. I'm not complaining, she told him one evening as they sat on the store's back porch, the mountains dark silhouettes against the star-scattered sky. Some might call it a lonely life, but it's a purposeful one. Still, Ethan said, a woman like you should have choices. She laughed softly, the sound like water over stones. What choices? To marry one of the miners who can barely feed themselves, to be courted by men who see me as convenient because I'm already here. No thank you, Mr. Jameson. Ethan, he corrected. After a week of sharing meals, I think we're past formalities. She considered this, then nodded. Ethan, then, the way she said his name made something warm unfurl in his chest. As days stretched into 2 weeks, Ethan found reasons to delay his departure. The store needed more repairs, a shipment was coming that her uncle couldn't handle, winter was closing in and travel would be difficult. Each excuse sounded hollow even to his own ears, but Grace never challenged them, and her uncle seemed grateful for the help. The truth was, Ethan was experiencing something he hadn't felt since before the war, a sense of belonging. The simple rhythm of days with purpose, evenings with company, and the growing awareness of Grace herself. Her quiet strength, her flashes of dry humor, the way she hummed hymns while working, often unaware she was doing it. But the real shift came one cold October night when a driving rain lashed the town. Ethan was awakened by a crash from below, followed by Grace's cry of alarm. He rushed downstairs to find water pouring through the ceiling where an old leak had finally given way, threatening the store's inventory. For hours they worked side by side, moving goods, placing buckets, and fighting to save what they could. By dawn they were exhausted and damp, but the worst had been prevented. As the first gray light filtered through the windows, they sat among the chaos, sharing the last cup of coffee. My father would be ashamed, Grace said suddenly, her voice thick with fatigue. He built this place to last. Buildings break, Ethan replied. Doesn't reflect on him or you. She looked at him then, really looked, as though seeing past the polite barriers they'd maintained. Why are you still here, Ethan? The cattle drive left days ago. The question hung between them, demanding truth. Ethan found himself unable to give the easy answer, the one about good deeds or passing time. I don't know, he admitted finally. I tell myself it's to help, but I think I might be tired of just passing through. In the silence that followed, something shifted, a possibility neither had allowed themselves to consider taking root like the first tender shoot after a prairie fire. Their moment of connection was interrupted by Marshall's arrival downstairs, his face gray with pain and worry at the state of the store. The old man sank into a chair, looking around at the water damage. "That's it then," he said, defeat heavy in his voice. "Can't afford to fix this too, might as well sell to Hargrove while he's still offering." Grace knelt beside him. "We're not selling to that land speculator, uncle. We'll manage." "With what money, girl? Bank's calling in our loan next month. Railroad survey went south of here, town's dying before it lived." He looked at the water-stained floor. "Should have never brought you here. Should have sent you east to your mother's people." "This is my home," Grace said firmly. "I'm not going anywhere." Ethan stood silent, witnessing a family crisis he had no right to involve himself in. Yet as Grace's eyes briefly met his, seeking something, understanding perhaps, or merely acknowledging his presence as witness to their troubles, he felt the last of his resolution to remain uninvolved crumble. "What if there was another way?" he found himself saying. "I've saved almost enough for a small ranch, was planning to buy land up north, but—" Both Blackburns looked at him with confusion. "What are you suggesting?" Marshall asked, suspicious. Ethan took a breath, hardly believing what he was about to propose. "A partnership, my savings, your store, we combine forces, get through winter, rebuild in spring." Grace stood slowly. "Why would you do that? Tie yourself to a failing business in a town that might not survive." The real answer, because I'm beginning to think I couldn't ride away from you, felt too raw, too sudden to voice. Instead, he said, because sometimes a place or people get under your skin, make you want to build something rather than just keep moving. The proposal hung in the air, outrageous and yet somehow right. Marshall studied him with narrowed eyes, while Grace's expression remained carefully neutral, giving nothing away. "I'll need to think on it," Marshall finally said, levering himself up. "But I thank you for the offer, however strange." As the old man shuffled back upstairs, Grace remained, her eyes searching Ethan's face. "You don't have to save us," she said quietly. "That's not your responsibility." "I know," he stepped closer, close enough to see the gold flecks in her blue eyes. "But what if I want to stay? What if this is the first place that's felt like it could be home since before the war?" The word hung between them, home. Not just a place, but a feeling, a belonging that Ethan had convinced himself he neither needed nor deserved. Before she could answer, the door opened, bringing in a blast of cold air and the town marshal, his expression grim. "Grace Jameson," he nodded to them both. "Hate to bring bad news, but thought you should know, Jake Dawson broke out of the jail last night, stole a horse and disappeared." Grace paled, "The man who shot up the store." "The same. Swore revenge on you and your uncle before he left." The marshal looked uncomfortable. "I've sent word to the county sheriff, but with this weather." Ethan's hand instinctively moved to where his revolver would be if he were wearing it. "You think he'll come back here?" "Man's unhinged enough to try," the marshal sighed. "I'll keep an eye out, but thought you deserved warning." After he left, the store felt colder, the shadows deeper. The threat hung in the air, another complication in an already precarious situation. "I can't ask you to stay now," Grace said softly, "not with this danger." Ethan looked at her, really looked, and saw not just a beautiful woman but a partner, someone who faced life's hardships without flinching. In that moment, his old belief that the frontier was no place for love seemed not just wrong but cowardly. "I'm not running," he said firmly. "Not from a threat and not from—" He paused, searching for words. "Not from whatever this is becoming." She didn't pretend to misunderstand. "And what is it becoming, Ethan?" "Something I didn't think I'd find out here, something worth protecting." The days that followed took on a new urgency. Ethan moved his few possessions from the room above the store to the livery, insisting that he needed to be closer to the horses if trouble came. In reality, he was establishing a defensive position, creating a buffer between potential danger and the Blackburns. The town buzzed with the news of Dawson's escape. Some men formed a watch rotation, others checked their weapons, and mothers kept their children closer to home. But life continued, the store remained open, repairs progressed, and each evening, Ethan made his way back to share supper with Grace and her uncle. It was during one of these meals, as November's first snow dusted the mountains, that Marshall finally addressed Ethan's proposal. "Been thinking on your offer," the old man said, setting down his fork. "Not sure it's wise for a young man like yourself to tie your future to this place." Uncle, Grace began, but Marshall held up a hand. Let me finish, girl. I've watched you these weeks, Jameson. You're a good worker, honest as the day is long, but I've also seen how you look at my niece when you think no one's watching. Ethan felt heat rise in his face, but met the older man's gaze steadily. Sir, don't interrupt an old man, Marshall said, though without rancor. What I'm saying is this: if partnership is what you're after, it should be honest from the start. You want to stay because of Grace. And if that's your reason, then do it proper. Grace looked between them, her cheeks flushed. Uncle, you can't just. Can I? I'm old, not blind. Marshall turned back to Ethan. So what's it to be, business partner or something more? Because I won't have her heart toyed with by a man with wandering feet. The directness of the question stripped away pretense. Ethan looked at Grace, whose expression mingled embarrassment with something deeper, hope perhaps, or fear, or both intertwined. I came west believing a man was better off alone, Ethan said slowly. Safer, but these weeks here have shown me how wrong that thinking was. He turned to Grace. I stayed because of the store at first, but I'm still here because of you. Because when I think of leaving, it feels like I'd be leaving the best part of myself behind. The room fell silent save for the ticking of the mantel clock and the soft hiss of the lamp. Grace's hands twisted in her lap, but her gaze never left his face. That's not a proper answer, Marshall finally said, or a proper way to court a lady. You're right, Ethan agreed, surprising them both by standing. Grace, would you walk with me? Just to the church and back, the snow's not heavy yet. Marshall nodded his approval, and minutes later Ethan and Grace stepped into the crisp night air, their breath forming clouds in the lamplight. The first snowflakes drifted lazily around them as they walked in silence toward the small white church at the end of the street. Your uncle is direct, Ethan finally said. He's worried about time, Grace replied softly. His back's worse than he lets on, the doctor says, she trailed off, unwilling to voice the prognosis. I'm sorry, Ethan stopped walking, turning to face her. In the moonlight, with snowflakes catching in her dark hair, she looked ethereal. But he's right about one thing: I haven't been completely honest about why I stayed. Haven't you? Her voice was steady, but he could see the rapid pulse at her throat. I think you've been more honest than most men would be. Not honest enough, he took her gloved hands in his. Grace, I've spent 5 years believing that caring for someone out here was a fool's gamble. That love was a luxury the frontier wouldn't allow. But being here with you has shown me that maybe it's the opposite. Maybe love is the only thing that makes any of this worthwhile. Her eyes widened. Ethan, you barely know me. I know enough, he insisted. I know you're strong enough to face whatever comes. I know you have a kindness that doesn't expect recognition. I know when you smile, really smile, not the polite one you give customers, it lights something in me I thought was long dead. A single tear tracked down her cheek, catching the moonlight. I'm not special, I'm just the girl who was always here, never chosen, the one men pass by on their way to somewhere better. Then they were fools, he said fiercely. Because I've seen what's beyond this town. I've ridden from Texas to Montana, worked ranches and mines and everything between, and I've never found anyone I wanted to stay for. Until now. He brushed the tear from her cheek, his touch gentle despite his calloused hand. I'm not asking for promises tonight, just a chance to show you that your uncle's right. I want to stay because of you. Because I think we could build something real together, something that would last through whatever this territory throws at us. Grace looked up at him, searching his face as snowflakes gathered on his hat brim. And if I said yes? Would you resent me when spring comes and the open trail calls? The trail will always be there, he said. But finding someone who makes you want to come home at the end of it, that's rarer than gold in these mountains. She smiled then, a true smile that reached her eyes. That's quite a speech for a cowboy. Been practicing it in my head for days, he admitted with a grin. Their laughter mingled in the cold air, and as they turned back toward the store, Ethan felt something settle in his chest, a certainty he hadn't expected. Whether she accepted him or not, he knew he wouldn't be riding out when spring came. His wandering days were done. What neither of them saw was the figure watching from the shadows behind the church, his breath heavy with whiskey and his heart dark with resentment. Jake Dawson had returned to Willowcreek with vengeance in mind, and the scene he'd just witnessed only fueled his rage. The next morning dawned clear and cold, the fresh snow transforming Willowcreek into a pristine wonderland. Ethan woke early at the livery, feeding the horses and checking that his revolver was loaded before heading to the store. His conversation with Grace the previous night had left him feeling strangely light, as though a burden he hadn't recognized had been lifted. The town was just coming to life, smoke rising from chimneys as he made his way down the main street. He nodded to the blacksmith already at work, the rhythmic clanging of his hammer echoing in the crisp air. Everything seemed peaceful, ordinary, which is why the sight of the store's door standing slightly ajar sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the November cold. Drawing his revolver, Ethan approached cautiously. The snow on the porch steps was disturbed, showing multiple footprints. He pushed the door open wider with his foot, scanning the interior before stepping inside. "Grace," he called, his voice tight with concern. "Marshall." The store appeared untouched but eerily silent. Ethan moved through it quickly, checking behind the counter, then taking the stairs two at a time to the living quarters above. The rooms were empty, beds made as though no one had slept in them. Real fear gripped him now. He searched for signs of struggle but found none, just a cold stove and 2 coffee cups on the table, one half full as if abandoned mid-sip. On a hunch, he checked Marshall's room for his medications and found them gone, along with what appeared to be hastily packed bags. Back downstairs, Ethan noticed what he'd missed in his initial alarm, a folded paper on the counter with his name written in Grace's neat hand. He snatched it up, his heart pounding. The letter was brief but devastating. "Ethan. Dawson came before dawn. He has given us until noon to leave town forever, or he swears he will burn the store with us in it. Uncle cannot face violence again, his heart won't stand it. We are taking the morning stage to Helena. Please do not follow. I cannot bear to be the reason you come to harm. What you offered last night was more than I ever expected to find in this life, but I release you from any obligation. Find your ranch, build your future. Remember me kindly. Grace." The paper crumpled in his fist as Ethan checked the clock. 9:30. The stage would have left at 8. His mind raced. They couldn't have gone far, not in this weather, not with Marshall's condition. The road to Helena wound through mountain passes that would be treacherous after the snow. Without hesitation, Ethan locked the store and raced to the livery, his decision already made. The sorrel gelding was saddled in minutes, and he threw his few possessions into his saddlebags, along with ammunition for his revolver and rifle. As he mounted up, the livery owner emerged from his quarters, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "Heading out, Jameson? Thought you were staying through winter." "I am," Ethan replied grimly. "But first I need to catch that stage to Helena." "In this weather, you're mad," the man shook his head. "Roads bad enough in summer after snow." "Which way did they go, main road or the cut-through?" "Main road's the only way the stage can manage." "But listen, son." Ethan didn't wait to hear more, urging his horse into a gallop as soon as they cleared the stable doors. The town quickly fell behind as he followed the road north, pushing his mount as fast as was safe on the snow-covered ground. His mind churned as he rode. Why hadn't Grace woken him? Did she truly believe he would let her face Dawson's threats alone, or was she protecting him, giving him the freedom she thought he wanted deep down? Either way, he wouldn't accept it. Not now, not when he'd finally found something, someone worth staying for. Not when he'd glimpsed a future that filled the empty spaces he'd carried since the war. The road climbed steadily, winding through pine forests heavy with snow. After an hour of hard riding, Ethan spotted the stage's tracks, deep ruts in the fresh powder. He pushed on, knowing the coach's weight and team of 6 would slow it considerably on the uphill stretches. Near midday, as the road curved around a particularly steep section, he heard it, the crack of a gunshot echoing off the mountainsides, then another. Ethan dug his heels into his horse's flanks, urging it forward at a dangerous pace. Around the bend, the scene unfolded in horrifying clarity. The stagecoach halted at an awkward angle, one wheel caught in a drift. The driver crouched behind it, exchanging fire with 2 mounted men on the slope above Dawson and a companion Ethan didn't recognize. 3 passengers huddled inside the coach, visible through its windows, including Grace, her face pale as she sheltered her uncle's frail form. Ethan dismounted quickly, tethering his horse behind a stand of pines. He withdrew his rifle from its scabbard and circled wide, using the trees for cover as he worked his way uphill behind Dawson's position. The element of surprise was his only advantage against 2 armed men. Moving silently through the snow, Ethan positioned himself less than 30 yards from where Dawson and his partner had taken cover behind boulders. He could hear them talking, their voices carrying in the mountain air. "Just want the girl and old man," Dawson was saying. "Rest can go on their way." "Seems a lot of trouble for revenge," his companion replied. "Could have just burned their store and been done." "Not enough," Dawson snarled. want them to know what it's like to have nothing, want them to beg. The casual cruelty in his voice hardened Ethan's resolve. Taking careful aim, he fired a warning shot that kicked up snow inches from Dawson's position. "Next one won't miss," he called out. "Drop your weapons and ride out." Dawson ducked lower, swearing, "Jameson." "That you, Cowboy?" "Last warning," Ethan replied. "Walk away from this." Laughter, ugly and sharp, was Dawson's answer. "Two against one and we've got the high ground. You really ready to die for that shopkeeper's bitch?" The slur ignited something fierce in Ethan's chest, but he forced himself to stay calm. This wasn't about proving himself, it was about getting Grace and her uncle safely away. What followed was a tense standoff, punctuated by bursts of gunfire as each side tried to force the other into a mistake. Ethan held his position, conserving ammunition and waiting for an opportunity. It came when Dawson's companion grew impatient and tried to circle around, exposing himself momentarily. Ethan's shot caught him in the shoulder, sending him tumbling down the slope, his weapon lost in the snow. With the odds now even, Dawson became desperate. He loosed a volley of wild shots before making a break for his horse. Ethan tracked him through his rifle sights but held his fire. Killing, even in self-defense, was a burden he didn't take lightly. "It's over, Dawson," he called. "The marshal will be looking for you. Keep riding and don't come back." For a moment it seemed Dawson would accept defeat. He reached his horse and mounted awkwardly, favoring his left side where Ethan suspected he'd been grazed during the exchange. But then he wheeled the animal around, hatred contorting his face. "Not over," he spat, "never over," and with that he charged not toward Ethan but directly at the stagecoach below, time slowed to heartbeats. Ethan saw Dawson's intent with crystal clarity, a suicidal charge, gun drawn, aiming for the coach window where Grace's face was visible. The stage driver was reloading, too slow to respond. There was no choice. Ethan's rifle cracked once, the sound sharp in the mountain air. Dawson jerked backward in the saddle, his pistol discharging harmlessly into the sky before he toppled to the ground. His horse continued running, disappearing around the bend. In the ringing silence that followed, Ethan made his way down to the stagecoach, his legs unsteady not from the steep terrain but from the knowledge of what he'd done. The driver met him with a grateful nod, already checking on his other passenger, a traveling salesman who appeared shaken but unharmed. And then the coach door opened and Grace stepped out, her cloak dusted with snow, her eyes wide as they found Ethan. "You came," she whispered, as though unable to believe it. "Did you think I wouldn't?" he asked, the rifle heavy in his hands. She closed the distance between them, her gloved hands reaching for his face as if to confirm he was real. "I tried to spare you this. I never wanted you caught in our troubles." "Your troubles became mine the moment I decided to stay," he said simply. He glanced at the coach. "How is your uncle?" "Shaken, but all right." Her eyes moved past him to where Dawson lay motionless in the snow. "Is he?" Ethan nodded grimly, had no choice. "He was aiming for you." She paled but did not look away. "His friend?" "Wounded, ran off." Ethan turned to the driver. "Can you make it back to Willowcreek?" The man assessed his team and the condition of the road. "Rather than try for Helena in this weather, we can bring the marshal back this way for—" He nodded toward Dawson's body. Within the hour they were heading back toward town, the stage moving carefully on the snow-packed road. Ethan rode alongside, watchful for any sign of Dawson's wounded companion, though he suspected the man was long gone, more concerned with his own survival than avenging his partner. Inside the coach, Grace sat with her uncle's head pillowed in her lap, the old man having fallen into exhausted sleep once the immediate danger passed. The traveling salesman kept glancing nervously out the windows, as though expecting more outlaws to materialize from the pines. As they descended into the valley where Willowcreek nestled, the afternoon sun broke through the clouds, turning the snow-covered landscape into a glittering expanse. It was beautiful in a way that caught at Ethan's heart, a beauty made sharper by how close he had come to losing his chance at a future within it. By evening, they had returned to town. The marshal and a hastily formed posse rode out to recover Dawson's body in search for his accomplice. The doctor was summoned to examine Marshall, who was put to bed with a sedative to calm his frayed nerves. The stage continued on to the next town with its rattled salesmen, leaving Ethan and Grace alone in the store's small kitchen. They sat at the table, steam rising from cups of coffee neither seemed inclined to drink. The events of the day hung between them, too momentous to easily discuss. Finally, Grace broke the silence. "I thought I was protecting you by leaving. I never meant to put you in danger." I know, Ethan reached across the table, his hand covering hers. But that's not how this works, not how we work. We, the word carried a weight of uncertainty. Yes, we, he held her gaze steadily. Unless today changed your mind about what I said last night. Grace shook her head slowly. It didn't, if anything, she paused, seeming to search for words. When I saw you coming through those trees, I realized something. All my life, I've been the one left behind, the one not chosen. I convinced myself it was enough to be useful, to have purpose, but then you stayed and you came after us, and suddenly, her voice caught. Suddenly I understood what it means to be someone's first choice, their priority. It terrified me. Why? He asked gently. Because what if I'm not enough? What if the life I can offer here isn't enough to keep you when spring comes? Ethan's hand tightened on hers. Grace, listen to me. The West is full of men running from something or chasing something. I was both. But all that running and chasing leads nowhere if you don't have someone to come home to at the end of it. He smiled softly. You are more than enough. This life, our life together, if you'll have me, is everything I didn't know I was looking for. In the lamplight, her eyes shimmered with unshed tears. I'll have you, Ethan Jameson. Though God knows what you're getting yourself into with a failing store and an ailing uncle. I'm getting a future, he said simply, and a partner to build it with. That night, with Marshall resting upstairs and the town gradually settling after the day's excitement, Ethan and Grace sat on the store's porch, watching as fresh snow began to fall. His arm around her shoulders, her head resting against him, they spoke quietly of practical things, repairs needed, winter supplies, the bank loan coming due. But beneath these ordinary concerns ran a current of something extraordinary, the certainty that whatever challenges came, they would face them together. Ethan no longer feared putting down roots, Grace no longer feared being left behind. The winter that followed was harsh, as Montana winters always are. The store struggled but survived, partly due to Ethan's savings and partly because word of his stand against Dawson spread, bringing customers from outlying homesteads who preferred to trade with a man of proven courage. Marshall's health deteriorated gradually, but he lived to see spring, and with it, two significant events. The arrival of the railroad survey crew, who announced that the planned spur line would indeed pass through Willowcreek after all, and Ethan and Grace's wedding in the small white church, attended by nearly everyone in town. It was a simple ceremony, but meaningful for what it represented, not just the union of two people, but the laying to rest of old fears. Ethan, who had believed the frontier was no place for love, stood proudly beside Grace, who had resigned herself to never being chosen, as they promised to face whatever life brought together. As spring blossomed into summer, Willowcreek began to grow. The railroad brought new opportunities, new settlers. Ethan and Grace expanded the store, adding a second building that housed supplies for the influx of homesteaders. When Marshall passed peacefully in his sleep that autumn, they mourned him deeply but continued the work he had started, becoming fixtures in the developing community. By the following spring, the railroad spur was completed, and the first train arrived to great celebration. Among the passengers was a young doctor looking to establish a practice in a growing town. He rented rooms above the new section of the store, and within months had become not just a tenant but a friend. On a warm evening in late summer, as they sat on their expanded porch watching the town's main street, now lined with new buildings and bustling with activity, Grace took Ethan's hand and placed it gently on her belly. Dr. Landry confirmed it yesterday, she said softly. By winter, there will be 3 of us. Ethan's expression transformed with wonder and joy. He gathered her into his arms, overwhelmed by the miracle of it, this life they had built together from the ruins of their separate fears. Your love changed everything, he whispered against her hair. Everything I believed, everything I thought I wanted. She laughed, the sound as bright as the future before them. And yours gave me what I never thought I'd have, a home that's more than just a place, a life that's more than just surviving. As twilight deepened over Willowcreek, now a thriving community with a future as expansive as the Montana sky, Ethan remembered the lonely cowboy who had ridden into town 2 years earlier, convinced that love had no place on the frontier. How wrong he had been. It wasn't just that love could survive in such harsh country. It was that love was the very thing that made it possible to truly live there, to transform mere existence into a life worth building. Grace, once the girl who was never chosen, had become the woman at the center of everything he valued: home, family, purpose, belonging. And he, the drifter who feared putting down roots, had discovered that the greatest freedom came not from constant movement, but from having something precious to return to, someone whose love made every struggle worthwhile. Together, they had rewritten the stories they had told themselves about what was possible, proving that even in the untamed West, the greatest frontier to conquer was the distance between two hearts finding their way home to each other.